This is BBC One in the South East. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Peter Sissons and Tim Donovan.
Just 2 days of campaigning left and the leaders step up the pace. Labour say every vote matters, it's not in the bag. Lord Archer's former secretary tells of the diary he asked her to falsify. Nepal's third king in 4 days as the country descends into chaos. The catch that squared the series for Pakistan after another spectacular England collapse.
In the southeast, 6 months since the murder of Damilola Taylor, police still looking for clues which will lead to his killers. And what now for the Biggin Hill Air Show after 2 crashes and 3 deaths at this year's event?
Good evening. Despite the opinion polls, they went for it today as if there was still everything to play for. Tony Blair urged One Nation Conservatives to join him, and he said all the landslide talk was a Tory tactic to keep Labour voters at home. William Hague said the nation was in for a surprise on Friday and produced his own action plan for government. Charles Kennedy, ambitious to be seen as the real opposition, went on the attack and didn't spare Labour. Our political editor Andrew Marr on the day's campaigning.
No, he isn't betting on the election result just yet. Campaigning tonight in a London club, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor insist they're not taking a single vote for granted. They're ahead and they are jumpy. Talk by Tories and journalists of a Labour landslide infuriates the Prime Minister. He thinks it may convince huge numbers of people not to bother voting.
Can I just say something to you very, very bluntly indeed? Right? The election hasn't happened. Right? It's not for you to determine the result of the election before it's happened. The British people are the boss.
Hello. They certainly are. But what deep down are they thinking? Whatever Mr. Blair says, his party is in a mood of mounting excitement.
Isn't there a great feeling coming right next Thursday? But before he tells us not to be complacent, it's about getting them turned out.
That's Labour people, of course, though not many of them were here. Meetings like this at Gillingham in Kent have been small-scale affairs this election campaign, designed for the cameras. Any landslide, if it happens, would come from far beyond the Labour family, and today Mr. Blair appealed directly to Tories to defect.
And I make an appeal to them. They are One Nation Conservatives. They do believe in economic strength. They do believe in a fair deal for people. They do believe in investment in public services. Well, I say to you, if that's what you believe in, even if you supported the Conservative Party in the past, look at the shambles they are today, look at the policies they offer, and then help us change this country for the better.
If that seems far-fetched, well, one Tory defected today. Tony Nelson, a former Conservative finance minister, announced he'd now joined Labour. Helpful timing. Mr. Hague's landslide warning does seem to have got under Labour's skins, but he's in an odd position because, as at his press conference this morning, he's also still insisting he expects to be in number 10 by the end of the week, with an urgent programme of European renegotiation and spending cuts.
Over the coming 4 days, we will spare no effort, hour or breath, so that on Friday you will be surprised and we will be busy.
Well, he may be fighting fate, but the Tory leader gives no sign of giving in. Tonight in Scotland, he was burning with scorn.
Tony Blair has already decided to claim victory. He talks arrogantly about having a mandate for change. I see no mandate, I see no change. Instead, I see a government which has squandered a massive Commons majority, plenty of public goodwill, and the best economy ever bequeathed by a predecessor.
Charles Kennedy for the Liberal Democrats has come a long way on the neither of the above ticket. As his weight has fallen off, his ambition has swelled.
If Labour wins again, there will have to be effective and responsible opposition. William Hague's Conservatives are going to be utterly incapable of providing it. The opposition, therefore, will have to be the Liberal Democrats.
In Scotland, of course, there's already a main opposition party, not the Tories nor the Liberal Democrats, but the SNP, today parading Sir Sean Connery, their biggest name by far.
Well, there's only one party that's for independence. There's only one party that's really got the Scottish interest at heart.
Labour's huge opinion poll lead has been like a kind of embarrassing, unwanted guest slouching through this general election campaign. It's led to all this talk of landslides and tactical voting and insincerity. In the end, Tony Blair's slogan today is something that the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats could also wholeheartedly endorse. Whatever you do, vote for what you believe in. Andrew Marr, BBC News, Westminster.
The rules on postal voting are to be reviewed after the election because of concerns about fraud. Under a new system introduced to improve turnout, anyone can vote by post and have the ballot paper sent to any address. A BBC reporter was able to apply for 7 postal votes in one constituency using the names of people who'd recently died.
The mail vans are still bringing in more votes. Ballot papers in these vans missed the deadline. But here in Stevenage, over a third of voters applied for postal votes, up to half in some neighbourhoods. At the town hall, they're preparing for the big count. Any voter can send in ballot papers from any address. The system has always relied largely on trust, but the risks are clear.
We're aiming to increase the turnout as much as we possibly can. But you can only encourage people to use their votes as long as you've got the proper checks and balances in place to make sure that, that the voting process is a secure and safe one.
Postal voting may be one answer for those who are worried about the problem of voter apathy. At the last election, fewer people voted than at any time since 1935. But if more people are to vote by post, there'll be new concerns about the problem of potential abuse and the need to guard against it. The system is vulnerable. Among the postal voting applications in the marginal seat of Torbay, 7 were sent in by a BBC journalist in the names of dead voters. They were all approved. Postal voting is supported in principle by Tony Blair.
Obviously, if there are any infringements of the rules, as with any electoral rules, they have to be properly investigated. But I think you will find that lots of people have managed to get a vote this time in circumstances where otherwise they wouldn't. So I think it's a thoroughly good thing.
The other parties were worried about the risk of abuse.
I think it would be sickening to think that you had any kind of results in this country. I mean, we all had such a good laugh, at the Americans' expense over that fiasco in Florida. Well, we've introduced this new system of postal votes, and if it's open to this potential level of abuse, this is not a good step forward whatsoever.
We cannot have a system that doesn't work either because of potential fraud or because you can't get the ballot papers to people in time for them to use them. So we need to look at the whole system and the whole of the legislation behind it.
In this election, ballot boxes around the country may contain 20 times more postal votes than last time. Voting by internet and by phone may be next. Today, the body which monitors election rules promised a review.
I think one of the issues is how much actual fraud there is. That we don't know at the moment. We're going to need to look at it. But you have to balance that issue of the possibility of fraud and the possible actual fraud against the point of postal voting on demand, which is to encourage people to exercise their democratic right.
So pillar boxes may increasingly become ballot boxes, but the time may have passed when the British voting system can rely quite so much on trust. John Pienaar, BBC News, Stevenage.
William Hague has started a 900-mile trip around key marginal seats in a final push before election day. Gavin Hewitt has been travelling with him for the second of his 3 reports on how the party leaders are performing in the run-up to polling day.
William Hague and his wife Fionn left London for the final days of campaigning, a helicopter tour that would take them the length of Britain. First stop, the Isle of Wight. Today, there was less talk of a Labour landslide. The Tories, he said, were still in the business of winning.
And in the opening days of a Conservative government, we will set...
This line was added when aides became concerned that the Tory campaign was beginning to sound defeatist. Today, they stepped up the pace with whistle-stop visits to target seats like Cheltenham.
William Hague's helicopter tour is taking in seats all recently held by the Conservatives, but none of them can they be certain of recapturing this time. Talk today was of plans for government, but here on the campaign trail, the ambitions are much more limited.
Then on to the Wirral and a country house reception with party workers. Envelopes were energetically being filled, but privately, some Conservatives are saying William Hague has focused too much on issues that are not the priority with the voters. If there is one reason why people should vote Conservative on Thursday, what is it?
Well, of course, there are many reasons, but if there is one reason, it is to keep the pound and stop handing over the rights and powers of this country to Brussels.
But what do you think matters most to the voters? Schools and hospitals or the euro?
I think all of these things matter. I think a great mixture of things matter.
Yes, what do you think matters most? You've been on the election campaign for over 3 weeks. What do you think is at the heart of the British people? What matters most?
Well, what matters most is having a government that is straightforward and will deliver on its promises.
The fact is, the leader's team still resolutely believes the future of the pound is their trump card. And on a personal level, they think the presence of Fionn has helped William Hague's image, although she remains a largely silent partner.
Fionn, have you enjoyed the campaign?
Very much so.
Even William Hague's critics respect his resilience, but he knows that doubts are already surfacing within his own party. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, The Wirral.
And our political editor, Andrew Marr, joins us from Westminster. Andrew, what do you think's going on here now? Is Tony Blair genuinely rattled by the apathy talk? Is William Hague genuinely seeing signs of hope?
Well, I can't find anybody on either of those camps who think that the opinion polls are that wrong. There are plenty of people who say that the gap is smaller, that there's still things to play for, that the votes aren't counted. But everybody seems to accept that Labour is ahead by a fair margin, and that gives both of them different problems. Tony Blair has been saying, I don't take anything for granted, it's all still to play for, and yet you can't find anybody in the Labour Party who doesn't think that they're ahead, really. And on the Conservative side, William Hague has to explain why he is both warning against a landslide and telling people he could still be Prime Minister at the end of the week. These two things don't seem to be entirely compatible. But I think what they would all agree on is that there are enormous, substantial differences of policy over Europe, tax and all those things between the parties, and it should, in the end, be about policy, not about counting the numbers before the vote.
Andrew Marr, thank you. And on Newsnight over on BBC Two at 10:30, Jeremy Paxman interviews the Prime Minister Tony Blair. But now, the rest of the day's news. A former secretary to Lord Archer, who worked for him while he was deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, has told the Old Bailey that he once asked her to make up a false diary. Angela Peppiatt said she felt uneasy about the request, which was made 2 or 3 months before Lord Archer's successful libel action against the Daily Star. Lord Archer denies 7 charges, which include perverting the course of justice and perjury.
Angela Peppiatt came to the Old Bailey as one of the prosecution's key witnesses. Geoffrey Archer's loyal secretary for 2 years, she was in charge of his main diary. Her former boss, Geoffrey Archer, arrived himself, knowing Mrs. Peppiatt's evidence could be crucial in the case against him. In court, Lord Archer listened as Mrs. Peppiatt spoke of the weeks up to his libel case against the Star newspaper in 1987, a case in which she was accused of sleeping with a prostitute. She told the court he came to her with a new blank diary and a list of names to put in it. But she said, I was obviously extremely concerned about this request. In fact, I could barely understand why he was asking me to do it. It was something that made me very uneasy. When he told her his lawyers said it would be a security risk to hand over the real diary, she said, to a degree I was reassured about this, so I filled it in. According to the prosecution, it was this newly created diary that ended up being used in Geoffrey Archer's epic court battle against the Star, a battle he won. Mrs. Peppiatt told this court that she'd made her own note about everything she'd put in that diary. She was asked why she'd done this, and she said, by then I was seriously concerned that I was going to be involved in a deception, and I needed a form of protection. Lord Archer, here leaving court tonight, denies switching the diaries in order to give himself an alibi for the time he was allegedly with the prostitute. He also denies lying about it in the libel case. Mrs. Peppiatt will be back in the witness box tomorrow when this trial continues. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News at the Old Bailey.
Nepal has a new king, the third, to debate the issue of how to help the poor. Yet Britain has the worst levels of child poverty in Europe. Our social affairs editor Neil Dixon has been to a Newcastle housing estate to see how people there have fared since the last election.
This is the Britain we haven't heard much about during the election. On the Cowgate estate, many households have no one who works. Under both the Conservatives and Labour, money's been spent here. But as Emma Lehman points out, poverty and the stigma that goes with it remain.
Well, people just don't really want to move on to the estate because of the reputation now it's got. But I think that's a bit of a fallacy in some parts, because some parts of it are really nice. It's just certain areas on the estate that are run down and have bad influences.
A lone parents group meets at the church hall. Nearly 7 out of 10 children on the estate are from one-parent families. Labour has increased benefits significantly, but most help has gone to those in work. Many here claim life is a struggle and that work is not an option.
It's hard because when they're ill, you can't get childcare when they're ill, and in holidays and the summer holidays and things like that, so it's really difficult.
The trainers are falling to bits at the minute, but I just can't afford to replace them, not the ones they want. No, it's not getting any better.
I still live in the same housing estate with the same problems. It's what I did 4 years ago, and I haven't seen anything in the way of development in our estate apart from they've changed the lights. We've got brighter lights on the streets now so the burglars can see what they're doing.
Many of the residents living here feel the political parties are not really in tune with their concerns. It's just a few days until the general election, but on this estate you wouldn't know it. There's not a single political sign or poster up anywhere. In some senses, these are the forgotten voters. The parties may not have been talking much about poverty, but they do have policies. The Conservatives want even tougher rules to encourage people off benefit and into work. Labour says it'll halve child poverty in 10 years. The Liberal Democrats are offering £200 to families who've been on benefit for more than a year. And yet, for all the promises, there is a sense that prosperous Britain has left places like this behind.
People on the estate do feel socially excluded and concentrate their minds on just getting through the week with their weekly budgets, and indeed taking on loans just simply to top up their weekly income rather than spending that money on fridges, cookers, etc., as Middle Britain might do.
Not a prison, but the local comprehensive. Fairfield was one of Labour's so-called Fresh Start schools, but teachers were assaulted, exam results were abysmal, and the superhead quit. It will close next year. A reminder that even with politicians' best-laid plans, success in tackling deprivation and alienation is not guaranteed. Neil Dixon, BBC News, on the Cowgate estate in Newcastle.
So how does Britain's recent record on poverty measure up, and have the poor gained under Labour? Peter Morgan's been looking at the figures.
Under this government, just like the last, the gulf dividing the rich from the poor has grown wider. Millions of people in Britain still live in relative poverty. But relative is an important word. That's because governments don't measure poverty by how many fridges or video recorders you own, but by how many families receive less than half average income. So as the country gets richer, the income level used to define poverty goes up as well. And on this relative measure, poverty in Britain has been growing fast. Back in the late 1970s, 13% of households were poor. That had risen to almost a quarter by 1998, the last full year we have figures for. Child poverty has risen faster, from 15% to a third of children living in households that are poor. And this is why.
The gap between the rich and the poor has grown enormously over the last 20 years, over the 1980s, but also over the 1990s. And as that's happened, the incomes of people on the lowest incomes have fallen relatively behind those who are better off.
The Chancellor, Gordon Brown, has been actively taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor to try and redress the balance. The poorest tenth of society has been made 13% better off by the budget changes of the past 4 years. But the richer you are, the less you've gained, with the richest tenth getting almost nothing at all. On Britain's housing estates, where many of the poorest still live, these changes are measured in hard cash. Take, for example, a single unemployed parent living in a council flat with a couple of young kids. In 1997, that family would have got £98.70 a week in benefit. That's now grown to £130.45 and will increase again to £133.45 later this year. Allowing for inflation, that's a 25% increase, historically an unprecedented rise. But it would represent only a first step for any government that wanted to reduce relative poverty to the levels of a generation ago. Each of the major political parties says it wants to encourage wealth creation, but a central challenge for all remains how to avoid excluding the poorest section of society from the country's growing prosperity.
For a few moments today, the Prime Minister came face to face with himself in the form of the impressionist Rory Bremner. He's provided some of the lighter moments of the campaign, and as if to underline the history of political satire, a new exhibition of political cartoons and caricature has just opened in London. Our arts correspondent Rosie Millard reports.
I mean, John Prescott, I think he's the most, he's the most loyal, he's the most supportive, and I think in many ways he's the most randomly violent.
The Prime Minister on the hustings, or was it his alter ego? Seconds later, the man and his impression almost met, but Rory Bremner could only connect with the Chancellor. British politics has always been confounded by mockery. An exhibition devoted to the caricaturist James Gillray opens this week at Tate Britain. It positions the 18th century cartoonist's work, lampooning leaders from the Prime Minister, William Pitt, to the King, George III, alongside modern cartoons which do much the same thing to the leaders of today.
William Hague, with the greatest respect to him, does look hilariously funny. I mean, he's a strange little gnome of a man. And really, you can draw him straight, and there he is, immediately recognisable, and looking like a cartoon.
In some cases, the spirit of Gillray could hardly be closer, regardless of which victim is driving the chariot.
Tony Blair is big ear, huge grin, conical head with sort of hair starting to fall out on top. Gaze slightly redolent of Margaret Thatcher, a mad eye.
The timing of this show couldn't be better. In fact, if you're dismayed with our current crop of politicians, it might serve as a good reminder that British politics has long been associated with mudslinging, sleaze, spin and mockery. Rosie Millard, BBC News, Tate Britain.
It's 10:32 and a bit, and Newsnight is starting now on BBC Two with Jeremy Paxman interviewing Tony Blair. I'll be back in a few minutes here on BBC One with the headlines, but first